Hello, and welcome to the Radiant Mission podcast. My name is Rebecca Toomey, and we are on a mission to encourage and inspire you as you're navigating through your life and with your relationship with Christ. We have been in a series on homeschooling, and today we welcome Leah McDermott. She is a former master educator turned radical unschooling advocate and mama of 3 boys. She's the owner of Your Natural Learner and Bridge Academy, where she provides resources and community for natural learning and homeschoolers around the world. After years spent in the public school classrooms, Leah recognized the disconnect between what we know to be true about how learning happens and what we're doing to our children in the system. So in 2011, after having her first child, she made the decision to step away from the public learning system and began her work in encouraging and supporting homeschooling families to raise a new generation of confident and passionate lifelong learners. Today focuses on helping parents shift their mindset to trust their children that they are capable of learning what they need to learn when they need to learn it. I am so excited to learn from you today, Leah. Thank you so much for being here.
Hey, thanks for having me.
Awesome. So we'll just dive right in. Could
Yeah.
you share a bit about your journey from being a master educator in public school to becoming a radical unschooling advocate? What prompted that shift?
Yeah, I love to tell my story because it's like I've gone all the way around, like completely full circle through my life. So I actually was like many of us, went to the public school system as a child and purely out of circumstance because my father was in the military and we were stationed overseas in this tiny little community where there were not a lot of public school resources. When I was in fourth grade, they actually encouraged my parents to homeschool me, which
Interesting.
at the time in the early
Okay.
90s, nobody did that, right? Like it wasn't even legal in every state. Like it was
Hmm.
just not a thing. And so they did. But because of the stigmas around it, because of the legalities around it, my homeschooling experience as a child still looked very much like school at home. It was
Okay.
extremely rigid. We still had all of the curriculum and tests and quizzes and a homeschool
Mhm.
classroom and red pens everywhere. So it was still in a way, it was almost like I was the only student. So it was even harder to like make it through than being in the public school where I probably could have skated with doing a lot easier work.
Mhm. Yeah,
But
that's a lot of pressure.
it is for sure. But I was one of those people that school came very easy, testing came very easy. And so that was my identity, right? Was a student. I was going to just be a student. And so naturally, as many of us can probably relate, I wanted to be a teacher when I was done being a student, because it was all I really knew how to do very well.
Mm-hmm.
And so I went to college to be a teacher and I went all the way and got 2 master's degrees in education. I was going to be the best teacher and started teaching in the public school classrooms. And I started in kindergarten. And
Okay.
aside from, the emotional pieces, which I didn't have my own children yet. So they didn't connect with me as much, right? Like sad kids not wanting to be away from their moms, the emotions of all of that. But what I saw was they were still, at 5 years old, 6 years old, they are curious, they're creative, they're asking questions, they believe in magic, they want to do all of the art and they want to play and they want to learn. They're seeking all of the knowledge that the world has to offer them. And
Mm-hmm.
so I spent a few years in kindergarten and then the district did some changing around and I was moved to a fifth grade classroom. So I went from K straight to fifth grade. And that first day of fifth grade was the first really big light bulb moment for me because I noticed immediately when those children walked in the room that the light was gone from their eyes. They didn't want to be there anymore. School was not fun. Learning wasn't something that they saw as a joy. They didn't want to engage. They weren't curious. They weren't creative anymore. They didn't believe that they were good at things. It crushed me because
Wow.
it was like, what have we done? What did we do in 4 years to these
Yeah.
children that now
Yeah.
they hate it here? What happened? And so I stayed in fifth grade and my mission was to change it from within, which of course is, when you're a tiny little wheel in a very big system, that doesn't really happen.
Mm-hmm.
And then I got pregnant with my oldest and he's almost 14. So this was, 14 years ago. And that was the second light bulb, because I knew that I would never put him in that system.
Mm,
And I realized that I was being a hypocrite if I stayed in that system as a teacher, but I would never put my own child in it. Then I was just the perpetuator of the trauma that I was trying to avoid for my own children. So I left the classroom and committed to homeschooling my own kids. And when he turned about 3, a lot of those fears started popping up for me. Like, okay, well, now I have to do something. I have to do the teaching. So I
mhm,
need a curriculum to do the teaching because it doesn't just happen. And so I
mhm,
started doing some research on curriculums. And all I noticed was that they were exactly the same thing that was in the classroom. It was just school at home. And
mhm,
I still had those emotions of like being a bully to these kids, like forcing them to learn things they didn't care about. And I
mhm,
was like, okay, well, I'm definitely, that's not it. That's not the vibe. What are we going to do
mhm,
instead? And then I just stopped and watched him. It was like the third light bulb, I guess. And I realized he was learning on his own. Like the way that I was creating an environment for him, letting him explore his world, reading to him, talking to him, he was already curious, as all kids are. All I needed to really do was provide those opportunities for him. And I had never heard of unschooling. I don't think it even really was a big word, 13 some years ago. But
mhm,
that's kind of what naturally, when I just paid attention to my child, is where I led. And
mhm.
so some of the activities that I did with him, I did start writing down, which turned into the curriculum that I offer, which is the Your Natural Learner curriculum. It's very child led. But I just followed my kids. Now I have 3 of them. We do that. They are confident, they are capable, they are creative, they have existed. They're now 13 and 10, and then my youngest is almost 4, but they have never been forced to learn something, and they have
Mhm.
never been forced to prove that learning to someone. And I know a lot of people think that okay, well, it's easy to homeschool when they're little, but when they get older, that's when I could never do it.
Mhm.
And watching them, it's every year it's better because I get to see the difference between how my children engage in the world and how their peers who go to public school engage in the world. And it
Mhm.
is so different. So that's kind of like my whole full circle story of how I went from one side to the other. But yeah, it's really remarkable to see what happens when they are unencumbered by timelines and force and pressure.
That's amazing. It really is. I mean, like you said, school is very rigid
Mm,
in about going from this milestone to the next, to the next, to the next. And really, learning is not linear for every child. Every child is so, so different.
mhm.
So tell me about how that works with testing. Do you still have to, are you still required to go through standard testing and things of that nature? Is everyone in every state? Do you have
Mm.
any advice for parents on how to navigate that part of the landscape?
Definitely. So that's actually why I started Bridge Academy a couple of years ago. So I lived in a state where the homeschooling regulations were very minimal. All you needed to do was basically let them know that you were homeschooling, and that was it. They didn't check on you. You didn't have to turn anything in.
Mhm.
So I didn't really think about that aspect of it. And then 4 years ago, we moved to a state that is more heavily regulated, and you have to meet with evaluators and keep portfolios and turn in standardized tests in certain years. And as somebody who has a background in education, that didn't intimidate me because I know how to do all of the paperwork part of it, right? The little
Sure.
pieces of proof. But I realized what a stumbling block that would be for parents who didn't have that, or
Mhm.
who really did want to lean into unschooling and then feel like they had to backpedal and prove something to the state or some random person who didn't get the full picture of the life their child was living. And so that's why we started Bridge Academy, which is a private school for homeschoolers and unschoolers. And so, in pretty much every state, when parents enroll their kids in our school, they are not even considered homeschoolers anymore. They are legally considered private school students. Or in the
Ah,
states where we can't do that, we do the homeschool paperwork for them,
okay.
so that they can just focus on their kids, focus on life and living and learning, and we take care of the rest. And it removes those burdens of standardized testing, or if there's like 2 states where they still have to do it, but it's very minimal. Very
Mhm.
relaxed,
Mhm.
so we can remove a lot of those pressures.
That's amazing. Wow. I'm sure a relief for many listening because I know that that's a very challenging part of pursuing homeschooling for those that
Mhm.
maybe weren't homeschooled and this is a new concept for them is how am I going to navigate that? Especially
Yeah.
with what we're talking about today, which is unschooling and
Mm.
really not being a part of that structured model.
Mhm.
So, I would love to learn a little bit about what are some of the biggest challenges that you faced when really transitioning away from this traditional education system that we're talking about to unschooling your own children?
Yeah, mindset 100%. And the more I work with parents, who are on this journey, especially, fortunately for me, I had those light bulb moments before I had children of my own. So
Mhm.
I didn't have to walk that balance of deschooling myself and also my children as I pulled them out of that system. They, didn't ever have to be in it. But it is just a deschooling of your mind. And it's the school minded system. It's not just a system of like going to school, going to work, right? It's also the way that as a culture kind of permeates your thoughts. And for a couple of generations now, we've been made to believe that learning only happens inside a classroom, at a desk, with a textbook, from a teacher, in these, rigid structures that just isn't true. That's not how learning happens. Learning doesn't stop when we turn 18. It actually really began. I've learned way cooler things after leaving high school than I did in public school. So it's really just, it's a mindset shift. There's so much that we have to detangle about what we believe about learning, what it looks like and how it happens and the uniqueness of each person out there. Even before we hit record, we were talking about the uniqueness of each of our little children.
Mhm.
And then we expect them all to sit in a room and act exactly the same way and learn the same way. And that's just not realistic. That's not true. That's not the reality. So it's a lot of deschooling work for ourselves. Actually, as soon as I'm done with this podcast, I'm going to be recording a masterclass about fear because that's what happens. These things just pop up for us about comparison. If you're the first person to choose a homeschooling path or an unschooling path, that can be really terrifying to be that brave person when your neighbors are all going to school or your mother-in-law doesn't support you or even your partner often doesn't understand why you want to keep them home, why they shouldn't be in school. So it's a lot of being able and willing to tune into yourself and maybe dig up some of those uncomfortable memories of why do I feel that way? What made me feel like that? Why don't I believe that? Or why do I believe this? And just being willing to do that work over and over again, because even like almost 20 years on this journey, I still have moments where I have a fear that pops up or I
Mhm.
question something. And if I only ever ignored that or reacted to it, I would never be able to continue the work that I'm doing. So
Mhm.
we have to keep detangling those beliefs to be able to step out of that system fully.
Absolutely. You made so many great points there. And I think that one of the biggest things that you pointed to is as a society, we very much have this herd mentality where
Mhm.
we do what everyone else is doing. And to step outside of that is what is challenging and what is hard. And that's why people like you that are doing this work to say, no, look, we're doing it and it's working. It allows others to say, okay, well, if she's doing it and she's created this whole system for making it work, then perhaps I can do that too. And I know that public school and private schools are very much like this, that it's like,
Mm.
well, this is what everybody does, right? Everybody, I mean, I started to experience this with my first when she was around, I guess, closer to 4. Every single person, everywhere, it seems like we would go, "Are you starting school soon? Are you starting school? When are you gonna go to school?" And started asking her about
Mhm.
going to school.
Mhm.
And I thought that's such a weird thing. It's kind of like
Yeah.
when you're pregnant and people ask you all those weird pregnancy questions.
Yeah.
I never thought that that was a thing with children,
Yeah.
that people just start asking your kid at 4 years old, "Are you excited about going to school?"
Mm.
And then, of course, I have to step in and be like, "Well, she's not going to school."
Mm.
So And then they're like, "Oh, weird.
Yeah,
Okay."
yeah, and then you have to step into this role of, like, advocate too, not just for yourself, but for your child, and then for this alternate way of existing.
Mhm.
It's interesting you bring that up. I just put up a post the other day, I was talking about it on my Instagram about how the only adults only know how to talk to kids about school because all we know
Yeah,
how to
I
do with
saw
each
that
other
post.
is talk about
Yes.
work. And
Yes.
it's just this cycle because it's been ingrained. Like as soon as we are like 3 years old and go to preschool, that's it. During the day,
Mhm.
Monday to Friday, your time is someone else's the
Mhm.
whole time you're a child, and then it just conditions you to be that way for work, and that's all we know how to talk about.
Yeah.
And it's, when you realize that, you start paying attention to it and seeing like that's all we ever ask kids. Are you excited about
Mhm.
school? Did school
Yeah.
start? How's school going? How are your grades? Like nothing about them as individuals.
Absolutely. That's funny that you say that. My daughter is in a dance class, and the teacher, the first thing she did in their class, everyone was sitting down, and she said, "What'd you do at school today?"
Mm.
And it's funny because none of the kids wanted to talk about school. They all just changed the subject and started talking about other stuff that was interesting to them.
Mhm.
And me and the other parents were kind of like laughing to ourselves because it was all random stuff. They're between 4 and 6. And it just, that isn't what was exciting to these kids that did go to school. Obviously, my daughter doesn't.
Mm.
And all she wanted to talk about is roller coasters or something. And it's just interesting. You're absolutely right. I did see your post the other day and I thought, man, that's so funny. But that
Yeah.
also kind of triggered something for me because I feel like when I'm in a group setting or if it's my husband and I don't feel like people ever ask me, what do you do? I think that people are
Mhm.
so nervous about asking a woman these days, like if she works or doesn't. And so they
Yeah.
always go straight for the husband and they say, what do you
Yeah.
do for work?
Mhm.
And they open a can of worms when they start talking to me because, then I get started talking about this podcast and all the other
Right?
my actual day job
Yeah.
too. But, it's interesting the perceptions that society has. And then to
Mhm.
tag on to the other part of this about it preparing you for work, I mean, is that not what school is?
Mm.
They wake up in the morning before the kid should even be awake. So just so
Definitely.
you know, I don't know if you know this, I was homeschooled. I was
Oh, I
actually
didn't.
homeschooled from the beginning until I actually started college at 16.
Okay.
And my mother never woke me up.
Mhm.
She didn't wake me up in the morning. I woke up when I woke up, which was usually around 9. It
Mhm.
wasn't like I was sleeping until 2 p.m.
Right.
And I see so many moms that are starting to take their kids to kindergarten complaining about, I have to wake up at the crack of dawn. I'm waking up at 6. And
Mhm.
I'm like, I could not imagine waking my children up at 6 o'clock in the morning to prepare them to go do what they could do at home, right?
Yeah.
Learn the things that they could learn at home. But it's a system to wake up every day, rigid, go sit, you
Yeah.
know, you take a lunch break, you get back to it. And
Mm.
then what do we become in the end? We're
Yeah.
employees.
Yeah, little robots. And it's for all of the negative things that happened during the pandemic, I am grateful that it opened so many eyes to this
Mhm.
system
Mhm.
because not only did every parent suddenly see how much time was wasted with their kids every day, but the realization that as adults, we didn't need managers. We could do most of our work from home. We could
Mhm.
do it in 3 hours and not 8 if we were productive
Mhm.
enough. Like, it really has turned the whole system on its head, and one of the
Mhm.
things I'm really passionate about speaking about right now, especially since, like, one of those biggest fears is how do I make sure my kids prepared for the future? Like, okay, this all sounds great, but how will they learn time management and how will they learn to get up for a job and apply for a job and all of these things? But the
Mhm.
reality is that most of the jobs that exist right now won't be there when your child is old enough to get a
It's a
job.
good
Like
point.
the
It's a good point.
progression of jobs in this country and in the world, like AI is taking over it. So 10 years ago, there was a
Mhm.
study that said in 20 years, so we're already 10 years into that, in 20 years, 80% of jobs that exist will be done by robots. That
Mhm.
was 10 years ago. So now that projection is 10 years, and that was without the invention of AI yet. So now we see like how fast these jobs, regular jobs,
Mhm.
are disappearing.
Mhm.
And we can have discussions about that. But the reality is that when your child is, especially if you have a young child, when they are ready to enter the workforce, what will be there for them? And even today,
Yep.
The top employers in the world are not hiring people based on their SAT scores. They don't care how well you can sit at a desk. They want people who have creative ideas, who are inventors, good communicators, problem solvers, leaders, all of the things that are the opposite of what we're teaching in a traditional school system, which is do the same thing as everyone, get the right answer the same way as everyone, sit quietly, follow the schedule. Those aren't the skills that even the best employers want today.
Hmm.
So why is
Absolutely.
that going? That's not going to change. The school system, for all intents and purposes, has not changed in
Hmm.
60 to 70 years.
Yep.
And yet all of the world around us has. So
Hmm.
we can't expect to keep putting our children into this system and have something different come out on the other side.
Absolutely. I was laughing the other day. Some meme came up that was like, "Hey, remember when we were in college and computer was a class?"
Mhm.
You know, I took computer
Mm,
and it was, how to open Word, how to use Excel,
yeah.
and no one cares about that. I mean, if
Mhm.
you that's a basic skill, first of all, today, that if you
I
don't know
have
how to
to go
use
to my
Word or
teen now. I go to my
Excel.
teen to ask most tech questions now because I know it's like they're born with it now, understanding it more than us.
And that's why so many, I mean, we hear this from Google and Meta and some of these other
Mhm.
companies. They don't even care about you going to college. They want you to get to them as soon as possible. If you're going to work for them, come to us right away because we're going to train you how to use our tool sets, how to use our
Exactly.
programs, how to program you into our programming,
Mhm.
whatever the case might be. But you're absolutely right that the jobs change. And I think that it's interesting when you think about how kids spend 12 years learning history,
Mm,
and it's like, what are they gonna do with that in their actual
mhm.
application
Yeah.
of their job later, especially when we know that some of the history that we're being taught isn't even factual. It's
Yes.
very
And
much,
yeah.
you know Go
Yeah,
ahead.
and when we go to like math is the one, being somebody in the homeschool space dealing with people who have, judgment and all that. Math is always the thing they go to. I
Mm,
posted a TikTok the other day of my son fishing. That's what he was
mhm.
doing during the day while all of his friends were sitting in under fluorescent lights. He was out fishing and started a fire by the creek and cooked his own lunch. And these people came in the comments saying, "Oh, really great that he's learning geometry and calculus." I was like, I've literally never used those math skills ever after high
Yes.
school. Like, what a thing to focus on. But it's like, it's part of that
Mhm.
conditioning, right? Well, I
Yeah.
had to suffer through that. So
So
I'm
you
going to
should too.
hold that as part of my
Mhm,
identity that I made it through that. And now everyone else has to also, when the
mhm.
reality is that most of us will never use more than fourth grade math. So why do we argue? Like, there's an amazing TEDx talk about it from a mathematician that said, like, unless you're going to be a mathematician,
Mhm,
90% of the population won't use anything beyond fourth grade math every day. So why are
mm,
we forcing this like frustration and sadness and irritation of skills that they're never going to use again when we could be finding out what they're interested in and diving into that? And that's really the heart of unschooling, at the
yeah,
core
yeah.
is, what are you really good at and what do you really love? Let's try it. No other time in your life do you have the freedom to try things just because than in childhood. When you're an
Mhm,
adult and you have bills and responsibilities, it's a lot harder to say, "Oh, I'm going to just dive into crochet and see how I do with it." You can't do that as easily. But when you're a kid and you want to try something, there's no consequences to not being
mhm.
good at it or not making it a job. So really, shouldn't we be encouraging all of those things when they can and they have the passion?
Absolutely. Now you're actually jumping into that next question that
Oh,
I would love
perfect.
for you to answer because a lot of parents are new to this concept of unschooling. They
Mhm.
haven't heard of it before. They maybe don't know what that means. Could
Mm.
you define what homeschooling, unschooling is,
Yeah.
and how does it differ from a more structured homeschooling setting or approach?
Sure. So there's definitely still some myths out there about unschooling that it just basically means you do nothing with your kids, which couldn't be farther from the truth. Literally, I have to like turn my phone off when I'm doing recordings because my kids are like sending me all of these things they want to do. So what unschooling is it is a rejection of the schooled mindset. So, you know, for whatever that sounds like. It sounds really big and scary, but it's basically that you just keep living with your kids. You just embrace that at the core of who we are. We are curious, we are capable, we are creative. And that my job as a parent now is not to see my child as this empty bucket or this blank slate that I have to fill with information. I see my child as a whole human, already having their own personalities and their unique talents and interests and passions and goals in life. And my job is to provide them with opportunity, with experiences, with a safe space to try these things, with, encouragement and guidance so that they can discover who they really are meant to be. And when you strip away the mindset of the school structure, so the timelines, the checklists, the shoulds, you're really able to then see that just because every child isn't picking up these skills on the exact same timeline or at the exact same moments doesn't mean they never will or that it won't look the same. And I know that can be scary in the moment when you have an 8-year-old who's not reading independently, and that can seem terrifying, especially if you don't have like that pedagogy behind you of understanding that in most cases, kids aren't even ready to read until 7. That's a whole other thing. But if you take, if you zoom out a little bit, you and I are sitting here having this conversation. I don't care how old you were when you learned how to read. That doesn't matter now, but we put
Yeah.
so much pressure on kids to perform their knowledge for us. And for a lot of homeschoolers, that can be even worse because then not only is the pressure on our child, but we feel the pressure
Mm,
to also perform for the world around us that,
mhm,
no, I made the right choice. Look how smart my kid is.
mm,
That is like double pressure, right? Because then you have the pressure of, I want my kid to succeed, but I also need others to see that I'm not a failure.
mm.
And that can be a lot to carry if you're not willing to deschool yourself from that mindset. So that's what unschooling is really like. It's just a trust in children and in humans that we are capable, and that my goal is to make my children love learning or help them love learning forever,
Mhm.
not fill them with as much knowledge as I can until they leave the house and then hope they do something with it. That's the difference,
Yeah.
really.
That's such a great point about the parent because I
Mm,
think that we always have this innate, and maybe this is the ego of us, right? Our ego mind, that
mhm,
we feel that our children are a reflection of us. And in some senses, they are,
mm,
but it's not meant to be a judgment, right?
right.
Like, oh, my kids are smart or my kids are successful or whatever the case might be. Our children are individual people separate
Mm,
from us, believe it or not.
yeah. Yeah.
Right? It's like they're not us. They have their own brains and they can make their own choices. And we can encourage them, we can lead, we can, provide a fostering environment for them. But at the end of the day, they're their own people. And I think that
Definitely.
we have to get, like you said, we have to get out of we have to unschool our own minds
Absolutely.
to separate ourselves from, just feeling that way. And so it's funny because it's like kind of what I think we're both agreeing on here is not only is it make us a little weird to
Mm,
homeschool and a little weird to unschool, but then we've got to be even more weird and not care what people
yeah.
think
Yeah.
about
Mhm,
all of it.
mhm,
But I don't know about
definitely.
you. I mean, I'm so used to being weird for so long that
Yeah.
it doesn't bother me.
Yeah, and that was with the work that I do was the hardest thing because I guess and maybe it's just my personality. I've never cared ever
Hmm.
what people
Hmm.
thought about me. And so it was humbling for me to have to say, well, first of all, I married somebody who very much cares. So that was, that was a thing to have to help with. And I had children who very much care. So the universe brought that back around to me to see what that was like. But as I started doing, more work with homeschooling moms, I realized, oh, this is a big thing. Like people really, that's a thing. We have to address that. And
Hmm.
having a child who felt that way, who was very intimidated by other people's opinions, who did deal with being the weird one for a while, being the advocate for my children then, but also teaching them how to advocate for themselves was a really challenging hurdle for me to not feel like I always had to jump in and be like a mama bear, right? Or protect them, but to teach them these skills for themselves. And that's been one of the most amazing things about unschooling, really, is, and you mentioned that kids are their own people and they have their own voice. And we start to see this when they turn like 2 and realize they can say no, right? And but this is part of that, like, okay, well, I can send them to school and they can learn to like fall in line, or I can keep them home and we can have discussions and we can negotiate and we can talk about reasons and I can help them develop these skills. And while that seems so different from how we were raised, to just like be quiet, listen to your elders, listen to the people in charge, having older kids now being on the other side of that, like, kind of scary early time where we had to have discussions and I had to admit I was wrong and I could change my mind. Seeing my teenager not be scared to stand up for himself, to make decisions different from those around him, to stand up to an adult that's telling him something that's not true or not okay. I am so grateful that I went through some of those harder times when he was younger, to now be able to see him advocate for himself. That is my favorite thing,
Mm.
to be able to see that. So it's hard in the beginning to be different, but it is so worth it when you see the rewards and the benefits of that on the other side.
That's awesome. And
Yeah.
so different from previous generations, right? Where it's
Yeah.
like you just have to take it and you
Yeah.
don't have the opportunity to stand up for yourself. But what does that do? It crumbles your creativity and your ability
Yes.
to be an individual. We're so
Hmm.
used to staying in line.
Yeah.
And it is funny the difference between two. Once they turn 2 and they say no, my youngest is 14 months, and all she says is, yeah, yeah. And
Yeah.
I'm like, keep doing that. Keep
Yep.
doing
Here it comes. Here it
that.
comes.
She says, yeah. I go, no. And she cracks up. But I want to ask you for an example. You
Mm,
explained unschooling really well and how it's kind of it's allowing children to express so you said something about, you're probably going to have a bunch of texts about from your kids about things they want to try or want to do. So
mhm, mhm,
what does that look like in, let's say, elementary school
mm,
versus now you have middle school slash high school?
mhm,
How does that look as they progress and get older? I imagine, kindergarten, younger age, because I have one myself,
mm,
is very much, I want to learn how to play the guitar. We actually
mhm,
just got her a little ukulele and she's like, I want to learn how to play it, and learning how to play instruments and dance and those types of things and just pursuing that.
mhm,
What does it look like as they're growing?
mm. So it's actually really, really amazing, especially if they've never had the experience of public school or even like a rigid homeschool, because when they're younger, like I mentioned earlier, they're so creative, right? They want to try everything. And when you are not bound by those timelines and the structure and the curriculum and the rigidity, you can do that. And what I
Mhm.
tell parents is to let them try everything and be okay when they're done with it. Because when they're little and in elementary school, they're going to want to try everything naturally. I want to do this one thing and they want to go all in. And then 2 weeks later, they've gotten what they needed out of it
Yeah.
and they're done.
Mm.
So, my oldest, he was like all into basketball for a while and he was all into boxing and he played Dungeons and Dragons. He's had so many cool identities. And as quickly as they would arise, they would fizzle out and he would just be done with them. And there's always been like an underlying thing with him of loving nature and animals. Like, he learned to read when he was 4, because not because we forced it, but there was an animal encyclopedia in our house and he wanted to read the information about the animals. And so he would
Wow.
like sit there with his little 4-year-old finger and scroll down the index looking for animal names he would recognize and
Hmm.
then go to that page so he could see the picture. And even though all these other things have come up and we've tried all these other things, now that he's 13, being outdoors is the only thing he wants to do. And he's been able, because he's had those experiences of getting to try all these other things, he so confidently now knows what he wants to do. And how many teenagers can say they know what they want to do? They don't, because they've never even gotten to experience things for the most part, right? Because we tell
Mhm.
them this is
Mhm.
what you need to know, when you need to know it, how you need to know it, but never why. And they don't have the opportunity to explore and express themselves. And having that freedom to try all those things helps you narrow down the things you're really good at and the things you
Mhm.
really love. And so my middle child is 10 and he is all in as a soccer player. He's one of the best in our town. He plays on the travel teams because he's had nothing but time and his own time to practice and play and learn and read history about soccer players. So it's it looks like a whole bunch of crazy everything at first,
Yeah.
but by doing that, they can truly find who they are.
Mm.
And then it starts to narrow down and it narrows down. And as they get older, it keeps narrowing. And then it really gives you the opportunity when they're older to start saying, okay, I can see this is your trajectory. This is
Mhm.
what you love. What is the next step for you? And then you can have conversations about what does that look like for a job? What does that look like? Does that mean a college path for you? All right. What do you need to get there? And we get so nervous when they're younger that if we don't make them take tests or we don't show them textbooks, they'll never be able to use them.
Mm.
But that's not really how learning works. When we have the
Mhm.
motivation to learn something,
We
it's
will.
way easier
Yeah.
and the learning is much deeper and more contextual.
Mhm.
So now I can say to my almost 14-year-old, hey, these are the things that you really love. This is what's next for you. Here are the things we're going to need to get you there. Oh, okay,
Mhm.
cool. And he can pull out a textbook if he needs it, and he can take an online class. And it's way easier than trying to force him 5 years ago to do these things that he wouldn't have cared about.
Mhm. That's amazing. It's like learning earlier rather than I feel like a lot of people go through school, and I can even
Mhm.
include myself in this in some ways because I didn't really know what I wanted to do,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And as you get into college and you're trying to figure it out, I mean, think about how many people go to college because that's the next step after high
Mm,
school. They just go to college because what else am I going to do?
mhm.
And they have an undeclared major because they have
Yeah.
no idea.
Yeah.
They have no idea what they're interested in,
Mhm.
or they start to pursue something and realize that they don't like it or don't enjoy it. That was kind of, I was a little confused as I went into the college system because I was very strong in writing and I was strong in the arts. But, the people around me are like, be a doctor, be a
Mhm.
physician's assistant. And I'm like, I don't like math. I don't
Mhm.
like science. I don't enjoy it. It's not something, there's a whole huge irony around that whole thing too, because now
Mhm.
I'm very much far away from the medical system and my personal life and the way that
Right.
I birth babies and stuff like that. So it,
Mhm.
it, it was for a reason, right?
Yeah.
But it's kind of, I didn't pursue that stuff until I was already at the end of my schooling,
Mhm.
where imagine if I had been spending my time trying to really narrow what I was interested in. I think it would just show that it was the things that I already was expressing interest in as I was
Yes.
a child,
Yes.
you know?
Mhm.
Now, fortunately, I think that my mom did have some aspects of unschooling without really realizing it. You mentioned, you were at kind of the beginnings of homeschooling.
Mhm.
My parents were as well. They were in the state of Florida, and there were no laws for homeschoolers when
Mhm.
she started homeschooling in the 80s, with my oldest brother. And they had to go to Tallahassee and lobby and create this bill to protect homeschoolers because truancy was a big thing back then. And,
Mhm. Mhm.
so she was really figuring it out, but wasn't rigid in the sense she
Mm.
knew that school at home didn't need to be sit at a desk for 8 hours or six
Mhm.
hours or whatever it is and do your school. However long it took us to do our lessons, do your lessons and then you can go do something else. And
Mhm.
so for me, I'm very self motivated. So I'd go get my work done in an hour, half hour, 45
Yeah.
minutes, whatever it was. And then I would go do what I wanted to do. I would play outside. I would learn how to sew. I would sew quilts. I would
Mhm.
used to pretend, this is actually kind of funny, but my sister and I used to pretend to have a radio show and now we have a podcast. So maybe there was something there.
There you go. That's funny. It was
I
always there.
still I still want to get my hands on those videos from when we were kids
Oh my
because we used to
gosh.
record
Yeah.
ourselves. It was funny.
Mhm.
We had a little those little that cassette player with the
Yeah, the little
microphones,
Fisher
one on each
Price. Yeah.
side. Yeah, you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah.
So it's just interesting that, we ask kids what they want to do,
Mhm.
but it's all hypothetical, right? Like, what do you want
Mhm.
to do? Well, we're not going to give you any pathways or tools to actually help you figure out if that's what you really want to do. But go
Mhm.
to college, you figure it out there when you're paying for it,
Yeah.
$40,000 a year.
If
So
you're
I
lucky.
think, yeah, right. The, um, the idea of unschooling, providing the opportunity for kids to really figure that out sooner than later, I think is what's really attractive. As I'm sure you're hearing, Leah and I have a wonderful discussion on unschooling going on here, but we're not done yet. There is going to be a part two to this episode. We're going to discuss what curriculum looks like in unschooling and so much more. Be sure to tune in next week for part two. Thank you so much for tuning in and for being on this journey with us today. If you would like to follow along outside this podcast, join the mission on Instagram with the handle The Radiant Mission or on Facebook as well. And of course, this is also available in video format on YouTube. As a reminder, to find Leah, you can find her on Instagram at instagram.com/your natural learner, www.yournaturallearner.com, or www.bridgeacademy.us. Today we are going to close with Isaiah 41:10. So do not fear, for I am with you. Do not be dismayed, for I am your God. I will strengthen you and help you. I will uphold you with my righteous hand. We're wishing you a radiant week, and we will see you next time. Bye, everyone.